Welcome everyone to today's Shiny Gathering, where we are diving into one of the most exciting shifts in regulatory science, the use of R in FDA submissions. We are joined today by three industry leaders. Ben Straub, which is not here, but he'll be arriving very, very soon, Eric Nantz, and Sam Parmar. They have been at the forefront of the R Consortium FDA Pilot initiatives. And we'll be unpacking feedback from the FDA, exploring the current state of Pilot 4, and reflecting on the insights gained from Pilots 1 through 3. Plus, we'll look ahead to 2025 and discuss how these pilots are helping to shape the future of regulatory submissions using open source tools like R. Whether you are deep in regulatory work or just curious about where things are headed, you won't want to miss this conversation. First, I'd like to welcome, I was going to welcome Ben Strauss, but maybe we can start with Eric Nantz. I'd like to introduce Eric from Eli Lilly. Eric is a principal research scientist creating innovative analytic pipelines and capabilities supporting study designs and analysis. Outside of his day job, Eric is passionate about connecting with the R community and is the creator and host of the R podcasts, a Shiny Developer series, and the curator of the R Weekly project. Please go and check them out as they are very, very interesting and a great podcast to hear. Lastly, we also like to welcome Sam Parmar, Statistical Data Science from Pfizer in the R Center of Excellence. Sam thrives from seeking to improve the health of people around the world with critical thinking, problem solving, and collaboration. When Sam is not programming in R, he enjoys gaming and reading comics in the fantastic company of his small dog called Sadie. Lastly, I'd like to welcome Ben Straub from GSK. Hi, Ben. Glad to have you join us. He's a principal programmer at GSK. Ben enjoys the challenges of using open source software in a regulatory environment. Ben has led many initiatives around R adoption activities within clinical programming since his start at JSK, and outside of his study work, he's helping to develop and maintain end-to-end R packages pipelines that address all the needs of clinical reporting. He's one of the maintainers of Admiral. And I, Hi everyone, and maybe I'll pass the word to you guys so you can talk a bit and give an overview on the FDA pilots. I know that Ben has some
Yeah, I
sites that he
can.
wants to look at. Yeah,
Yeah, I can share the websites and kind of start the introduction. If that's okay.
cool. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. Um, Hopefully everyone can hear us. Let's see here. Window. Oh, good. Okay, got some thumbs up. Okay, so yeah, so first I just wanted to I'll put this on the other screen. First I just wanted to, the pilots that we're going to talk about today, they're sort of been set up by the R Consortium, which is I guess our kind of our sponsor that helps drive this initiative. And I just encourage folks to check out their website. They have a lot of other projects they sponsor that drives a lot of great change in open source. So the R Consortium gives us a lot of space on like GitHub and host our websites and stuff. So I just want to make sure they get a good shout out for their help here. And then also just a huge shout out to Absalon for hosting these series. I think they've been really fun to tune into over the last I guess, have you guys been running them for like a year now, or has it been over a year?
I think more than a year already.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
gone so fast.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, so just jump right in and give you guys all some context if you're not familiar with what we've been doing with these pilots is um, I guess we started back in 2021, and our mission has been to make easier R-based clinical trial regulatory submissions today by showing open, key word here, open examples of viewing current submission portals. And we think that that will lead to easier R-based clinical trial regulatory submissions tomorrow by collecting feedback and influencing future industry and agency decisions on system process setup. So we've done 4 pilots. Pilot 4 is, kind of like in a, we're hopefully rounding the end of that one. And pilot 5 has just been starting. And, each one we've learned, got some great feedback from regulatory agencies and used that to kind of help build some tools or to help answer questions as we move through these pilots. And so pilot 1, each pilot, we try to keep it very simple because really we're not trying to build a giant R submission. We're really just trying to explore how the regulatory agencies receive the R scripts or data sets made in R or TLFs made in R and what their responses are with that. And so pilot 1 really just focused on delivering just 4 TLFs with some simulated data from the CDIS pilot. It took a little while to kind of package all that up and do the submission, and we'll talk about more about that as we go, like what we kind of built and issues that came up. So, I believe it wasn't until 2022 that we got the final FDA response that kind of said that like this was great. We love what you guys did. Gold star. So then with pilot 2, then the part that we were exploring was really looking at how if we could do a Shiny app with the same TLFs or the same tables and figures, if we could deliver a Shiny app through the portal, to the ECTD portal, which we'll probably talk about in great detail as we go. So, with a little bit of I don't know the exact timelines, and Eric, feel free to chime in when it was signed off, but it really there was a lot of good feedback from the FDA, from the regulatory agency on what they kind of thought was useful in the Shiny app and what was a little could use some improvement, and we kind of documented all that feedback and successfully submitted a Shiny app that just encapsulated the 4 tables, and I think it's 3 tables and 1 figure that was from pilot 1. And then for pilot 3, so pilot 3, again, the pilots are simple. We're just trying to test out the mechanisms to deliver an R-based submission. So pilot 3, instead of taking that data that was used in the original CDIS pilot way back in the day, we actually used R to generate the atoms that then fed into the 3 tables and 1 figure that was submitted in pilot 1. And so, we first got it submitted in 2023 around August, and then after some back and forth with the regulatory agency, and remember this is the FDA, when they're working with us, this is kind of like the side project they're doing to test these things out. So it does take a little while, and we'll probably talk about that a lot more as we go on, the responses. But they, gave a letter of approval for the submission on April 19th, 2024. Took a little while, but it was still valuable feedback on using R to build the atoms, and then R to build the tables and figures that were part of the submission package. And then for pilot 4, which, if Eric, do you mind kind of giving an overview of pilot 4? Because I think you're the most familiar, you and Sam.
Yeah, happy to, Ben. And yeah, thanks for the great foundation that we've been building upon here. So Pilot 4's idea came to be that with Pilot 2, it was an interesting challenge, I'll say, to get a Shiny application up and running and packaged to meet the requirements for the transfer protocol. But as we all know, enthusiasts about Shiny on this call here, there's been a lot of happening to make the infrastructure around Shiny a lot more modern. And in particular, I was enamored by two technologies that I thought could have immense potential here. One, what you may have been hearing about in the last year or so, is the idea of encapsulating a Shiny application into a WebAssembly format, so that when you browse through this application, you don't need like a Shiny server running it on the background. You can actually use your own browser's engine to run the application. There are a lot of modern web interfaces that are leveraging WebAssembly in many unique ways. And so we've been seeing the advancements from the Shiny team at Posit to bring WebAssembly to R, thanks to the immense efforts of George Stagg and many others on the team. And so we thought, why not just make Pilot 2 into a WebAssembly version of that application? There is another framework to Pilot for that we thought was just as important to test, and that's the idea of container technology. You may have heard about frameworks like Docker, Podman, that are runtimes for what we call Linux containers, which have been around for years and years, especially in the world of software development. And we have seen, many members of the R community start to take containers as a way to have a very nice, reproducible build environment when you have that provided runtime. So we thought, why not test both of these, compare and contrast the differences, how much easier it is to encapsulate the Shiny app into either of these frameworks, and more importantly, what are the challenges with it? Because nothing's ever perfect, right? So we are in the process of finalizing our second transfer of the WebAssembly version of it after some feedback we got last year from the reviewers. And likewise with the container one, we've gotten some recent feedback to try and encapsulate it in a slightly easier way for the FDA reviewers to install in their system. So we are hoping that gets complete, hopefully within the next month or so, for our next transfer. And then, we'll hopefully have a successful review out of it. But we see immense potential here with these technologies. Which one is best? I think that really depends on the use cases. But we thought it'd be a great opportunity to evaluate both of them, because they have implications on, frankly, not just Shiny itself, but other parts of the submission process going forward. So been a lot of great dialogue, and credit to Sam and others on the team that have helped me through this journey. But I think we're on to something really promising here with Pilot 4.
Yeah, and I'll just round it out with the final bits of the introduction. So with Pilot 5, our focus here is, so in each pilot, all the data has been in XBTs. So Pilot 1, Pilot 2, Pilot 3, we always used XBT files. Like we were reading them in, writing them out. So in Pilot 5, our big attempt here is to write out everything using a new format called dataset JSON, which has been explored with CDisk and I think it's COSA, which is, I believe, been, while not approved by the FDA, I'm pretty sure it's definitely it's under review, and it seems to be very positive. So we really wanted to explore building an R-based submission using dataset JSON and no longer having any XBT files in our submission. So we're just getting started on that work in the last couple months, and it looks to be very positive, and we're excited to push forward with that. And just to say, the group that runs these pilots, it's a open working group, so anyone can join, from any pharma, from a CRO, from academia, or if you're just kind of interested in learning about CDisk, R, submission process, definitely welcome to join us. And in the links that Sam has shared, you can definitely find ways to join on the Slack channel. And we're always looking for people to contribute. I mean, small contributions are welcomed, or large, you want to get really in the weeds of it, are also welcome. yeah, so that's the introduction. And we can definitely we're taking a laid back approach. We didn't have a epic slide presentation prepared or anything. So we're kind of hoping that we'll be driven by questions from the audience.
Yeah, we welcome questions from the audience. Any comments that you folks want to give? We have a very big house today with currently 112 people. But maybe I'll kick off with some questions on the FDA, on the feedback from the FDA from the Pilot 4. How was the first round of feedback from the reviewers?
Yeah, I can definitely take a crack at that. And one thing that we will make clear is that we're able to share, basic details, but we obviously can't share some other confidential information in the loop, in the weeds, if you will, of the feedback. But I can give you some general guidance that we received from them. What was interesting in Pilot 4 is that I had this conception, maybe it was a bias, if you will, that it was going to be the container technology version of Pilot 4 that would be easier for them to administer and install, because WebAssembly is a relatively newer framework, especially in the world of data science. I mean, we've seen Python users in data science use WebAssembly a little bit, but in the R community, it wasn't until really a year and a half ago that we really started to see some advancements there. And what was interesting is we were, bootstrapping the environments, and I do want to certainly acknowledge, Andre, your involvement in early parts of Pilot 4. You've been immensely helpful along with the rest of your colleagues at Absalon to get us started. It was about midway through as we were developing this and we're starting to get the logistics set out, that as our reviewers at FDA start to understand more of the WebAssembly technology, they were actually saying to us it might actually be easier to start with that one first, because we were taking care of a lot of the logistics in terms of transferring this with a robust set of scripts to bootstrap the environment. But more importantly, they didn't need a container runtime to run the WebAssembly app. They already had what they needed, a web browser. The one interesting nuance is that we still had to have them launch R to run a web process via the HTTP UV package, which actually Shiny does under the hood in a traditional Shiny app. When you do Shiny : run app, it's HTTP UV under the hood that's driving that interactive, you might say, ad hoc web server. So once the HTTP UV package made an update to make that even easier to bootstrap in a single line, we gave them very detailed instructions on how to, once they got access to the repository contents through the gateway, how to bootstrap that environment, run the simple utility script to launch the web process. And then we gave them two flavors to run the application. One, where they compile it on the fly, which most people do when they access a WebAssembly app, because then it bootstraps the R package repository specific to WebR, maintained by George Stagg at Posit, downloads all those packages. But we also gave them a pre-compiled version in case they wanted to have it run as smooth as possible from the outset. One interesting nugget that we learned is that while the pre-compiled version is convenient, it's also a bit massive because it bundled the R package dependencies in that bundle, such that we had to be creative in how we share that in the transfer. And we also learned that the reviewers are actually a bit more comfortable compiling that on their own machine, which followed a little bit similar process of what we did with Pilot 2, which used RM, the RM package manager, to manage the R package dependencies. We would give the reviewers in Pilot 2 a lock file, like in traditional RM infrastructure, and they would bootstrap the packages from CRAN. It would take a long time to install, like 5 or 10 minutes, but in the end, it was on the fly installation. So that was one nugget we learned, is that they prefer, installing everything in a dependency standpoint on their infrastructure without having that pre-compiled version. But it was good we tried it. We showed them it was possible, but it was interesting to see where they preferred to have a little more control over that actual dependency resolution. That was one thing we've learned. The other thing we learned is that container technology, even though it's been around much longer, there's just a lot more hoops they have to jump through to get things running smoothly on the container front. And that's where we're trying to find the best middle ground there and giving them very detailed instructions. And then once they have that, to have a very simple Docker file that will bootstrap everything, again, on the fly on their system. But it is becoming more challenging on that side of the Pilot 4, to be honest. But it was an interesting learning. I thought it would be flipped. So that's an interesting, I guess, potential for WebAssembly in this space. It could be potentially easier for the reviewers to run on their systems.
I'm keen to see the containers, be successful too, because that solves a lot of issues, for companies that want to have proprietary packages that they make, that they don't really want to share that widely, or the movement of the package to the regulatory to the FDA is a little complicated, and the containers could simplify it, but it feels like there's a lot to work out still with containers.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Sam, please.
The thing about the containers is also, I think, the technology that we thought the FDA would be interested in leveraging changed. I think initially we thought it'd be Podman, and then now, at least based on the last status update, I think it's Docker. So we're thinking about using a Docker-based container environment, right, Eric?
That's right. Yeah, we were thinking that due to Docker's rather unique license changes from a couple of years ago, especially some of us in the industry have encountered, that it was going to be similar for them. And then sure enough, it ended up being easier. And again, I can speak in generalities for them to deal with Docker itself as the runtime instead of Podman. So we did have to pivot even on that little bit of feedback, again, midway through this generation of the Pilot 4 container files. And one thing to be clear, and I took this approach with Pilot 2, is that for those that aren't aware, when the reviewers are typically looking at a submission package of our code or frankly SAS code or any other code that's involved in that submission, most of the time they are running this on their company or organization issued laptops or computing devices. Therefore, as much as me personally love to develop all my open source stuff on my Linux servers here in my humble little abode here and in my cloud infrastructure that I do a lot of, I have to test all of this in a Windows virtual machine to ensure that every instruction that we're outlining in the analysis data reviewers guide or ADRG for setting up the execution environment is actually going to work in that kind of structure. So with that, I've learned some of the challenges they've had to deal with setting up a container environment runtime, because on Windows, you need something called Windows Subsystem for Linux to run Docker or Podman or anything of that sort. So that was something that, again, through these pilots, if not for these pilots, I've never gone that extra mile to test that. But because we want to make sure that when throwing this over to the gateway, that they can run this at least as much as we can test as much as they could run it as possible. Always there will be some issues that come up. But I do agree, Ben, with your sentiment that the container technology has a ton of potential for many parts of a clinical submission package, not just Shiny. And I think that is the way the software development industry has been landing for many years. I think it's hopefully Pilot 4 will have some good benefits there.
Yeah, definitely. When I was presenting my Pilot 4 to the community, most people were interested on the containers based solution. So it's very interesting from the FDA that they are so into the WebAssembly, especially as the time when we were first developing, it was still in alpha or pre-beta stage. So that is very interesting. Go ahead, Ben.
No, just a couple of people asked some questions about I guess I'm not familiar with RIX. Is that an equivalent to RENV?
I can touch on that one, Ben.
Okay.
So for those of you that had the pleasure of watching the recent Shiny conference, I did indeed talk about RIX and NIX itself as yet another potential, and I do strongly say potential way to bootstrap dependencies for a software environment, such as like an R-based submission or Python or any of the other open source languages, it has immense potential to kind of be this in between of what you do in a container environment versus what you do in your host environment. I think Nix has a very unique way of doing a clever use of symbolic links and installations on your host system where you have these isolated sandbox development environments or execution environments. But when you enter that environment, it's not like the same, I would consider almost like a time warp or transformation warp as you go into Docker containers. When you go into Docker containers, you're running a different operating system under the hood in that container than probably your host environment. You have to be careful of volume mounts. You have to be careful of the fact that it can't really talk to the rest of your host system, and that's kind of by design. Whereas for Nix, you can kind of have the best of both worlds. You can have isolated versions of R, isolated versions of those packages. Yet in your host system, you could have another R installation. They're not going to conflict with each other. But if you have a program on your host system and you need to access from time to time when you're in this Nix environment, you can still do that, like Git, like maybe a VS Code or Positron or things like that. So Nix in data science is still got a ways to go, but when Rix was mentioned, that's the package by Bruno Rodriguez, and this package is now part of our OpenSci that lets you from an R session build a configuration, not too dissimilar to when you have a Docker container. You have to build a configuration via what's called a Docker file. In Rix, there is something similar, in Nix, I should say, there is something similar to that. Rix is your bridge to get that environment bootstrapped in your R session and do it with the confines of R. It's still early days, I would say, but it has immense potential. And I wouldn't be surprised if maybe a year down the road, after we have our learnings from Pilot 4 finalized, I am intrigued to explore Nix in a future submission.
Yeah, I guess it's Lehigh if you're wanting to lead a pilot 6, 7, or 8. Maybe the Rix, you could lead that.
Absolutely. We welcome, like you said, Ben, anybody to join this working group and really take a leadership role on some of these efforts.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience. Sean asks if has there been any end-to-end submission in R, example from EDC to defines?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
this was kind of answered already on chat, but maybe you guys can expand on that.
What were the answers? Yeah, I mean, I only know of Roche's and Novo Nordisk's submissions. They've been pretty public in those and presenting their interactions and what's happened. And then there's obviously our pilots that are very small. I mean, I want to emphasize again that we're just exploring things so people can see what we find in our interactions. One thing I did want to highlight too. I mean, it's, we do track all of our monthly meeting minutes when we meet as a group, and I think there's always some good gems in the meeting minutes about some of the discussions we have around different technologies, some of the blockers we have for working with the FDA. Take it all with a grain of salt, but I think there's some gems in there.
Yeah, certainly in those working group meetings, each of our pilot teams will have their own separate sessions to get really in the weeds from the dev standpoint. But when we bring the broader group together, I can tell you there's been more than a handful of these where I learned something, whether it's from the FDA reviewers or our other colleagues from the different pharmas, that were huge inputs to how we constructed the rest of these pilots. And that nugget I told you earlier about WebAssembly actually becoming easier for the reviewers to explore initially was one of those nuggets revealed in a previous working group meeting. So it's been quite valuable for us to have these monthly sessions.
Yeah, they've been great to generate new ideas for also future pilots. I think, Ben, you highlighted some of those ideas in the blog post that you did on the R Consortium website. But I think, we're as a result of some of these pilot efforts, specifically Pilot 5, we already thought about how can we start automating some of the ADRG generation side of things. And there's potentially a spin-off working group that's going to result from that. So it's just a really great setting to just share ideas and come up with new proposals.
Yeah, and these meetings are open to all. I mean, you don't have to be involved in a pilot, but so if you wanted to come check it out, definitely reach out, join the Slack. I think you can get added to the meeting invite. Yeah, I think they're fascinating.
Yeah. We have another question from Audrey, and what are the good practices to think about when thinking about container technology in the context of a submission?
It's interesting because before this pilot, we've only heard bits and pieces of some sponsors trying container in submission before. I can tell you one best practice that was revealed after some feedback from those previous efforts. Again, speaking generalities here, but there was one issue in particular that we were told by our colleagues at FDA that we should be more careful on with this container pilot is that they want to make sure that when they're running these containers that there is very minimal impact, if not no impact, on their host operating system. And I mentioned that concept called volume mounts before. If you don't know what a volume mount means in container technology, that's a way for you to say, hey, container, can you reach to this directory in my host system to import something or write something out? Apparently, in one of these previous attempts that a sponsor had for a container submission, there was some volume mount interactions, both from the reading side and the writing side for the container they were submitting. And I believe there was feedback shared with that sponsor. And again, we've heard, after the fact, that that's probably not the best use of the container environment. Instead, trying to make it as isolated as possible. It will have the R packages baked in, obviously, with the R installation itself. Again, pretty much treating it like a sandbox environment, I think, is the key with minimal interaction on the host system.
Thanks, Eric. We there are a bunch of other questions. I hope we have time to go through them all. And Red One, he asked if there is going to be any demo here, but I think that our pilots, they are so simple, like with just a couple of 3 TLGs, that it's not really.
Well,
Yeah.
one thing I can do, I can share in the chat the repository, and for Bill going back to WebR for a second, we have a link in the repository README where you can run the Pilot 4 WebAssembly app as a preview in your web browser right now if you like. But yeah, go ahead, Ben. I don't want to steal your
No,
thunder.
I mean, the stuff we made is not very exciting, sadly. I mean, while we definitely spent some time on it, it's like, pretty run-of-the-mill tables and figures, and there's so few of them. But it's really it's the process that we're exploring with the pilots that I think is so important, and gathering feedback from the reviewers about blockers that they face with, like, the operating systems, to installing packages from CRAN versus like, what do you do when you have a package that you don't want to put to CRAN? Those kind of questions, I think, of those are what are helpful here. So not so much a demo, but just like a lot of discussion about things we've learned, and and happy to answer questions that people have curiosities on.
Yeah, just to add one more thing is, similar to our main working group website, we have minutes. So we have basically a trace of exactly, how or why certain decisions were made, as well as the letters that we got from feedback from the FDA. So that's also just helpful in providing context.
Thanks. And Louisa asks if there are, what do you guys feel are the major hurdles in still being needed to overcome for a successful adoption of our submissions by the FDA? And
Oh, well, I mean, they've been I mean, my understanding is Roche and Novo Nordisk were successful submissions, and our pilots, while simple, were technically successful. Like they were signed off by FDA reviewers. So I think we're there. I think it's just there's a lot of nuances. Like I said, I alluded to like proprietary packages that maybe you've developed internally for some statistical technique that you are keeping for your study. Like, like you might not want to share it or open source it right now. Like, how do you get that to the regulatory agency? Um, you know, interactive dashboards, I think, are a big topic right now. Like, how do you move those over? But yeah, I think the nuts and bolts of doing a static submission, a static TLFL submission is there. I think we're here now with our base submissions.
And I would say another huge part of the benefit of these pilots is that we are building these as ways to not only share proof of concepts in this space, but everything's out in the open. And then also, again, going back to my early experience with Pilot 2, I cannot tell you how many hours I spent on that ADRG because it was one of those things where maybe from a sponsor perspective, you don't really think as much about, well, I'm just going to throw this R code over and, if they want to run it, fine. There's not a lot of attention to detail, at least in the past, that's been paid attention to in respect of, well, unlike a certain other proprietary package, R you can install multiple versions of, getting packages installed can be interesting if you're not familiar with the ecosystem. So I think one of the biggest hurdles we're trying to overcome is, again, getting the sponsor, or I should say the regulator, and we certainly hope to interact with our European agency colleagues in these in the future, of just the most robust way to get the execution of these R programs in a submission, whether Shiny app or not, so that it's very minimal friction, it's very straight to the point. Would I love to have a standard thing everybody could ship to regulators? Absolutely, I would, but that's never it's not going to happen, folks. Not for a very long time. So that's where having these references that the pilots are providing here, I think, will be helpful for the future, and maybe we do get more standards in place.
Yeah, you alluded to the ADRG, and that's something that I think is being looked at by Fuse heavily about how to make it more friendly towards open source languages. Because while I'm a huge fan of R and I'm very eager on its success, when we sort of a bit open the floodgates, because people ask a lot about Python now, which is a much more dominant language in the open source community. But they're welcome to start their own pilots, if they want. But it's I think the ADRG needs to be heavily looked at, and is by the Fuse group.
Yeah, so Eric and I, we've both been involved on some of that effort going on from the open source metadata documentation working group set up in Fuse. And it's been really nice just providing some of the perspectives, some of the lessons we've learned from generating a lot of these ADRGs and helping on that side of things. And how can we really carry that over to some tooling that we can use to populate some of the R-based or Python-based or sort of whatever open source language you're using, how can you populate some of that information automatically into the ADRG? So that's something that we're closely looking at.
Awesome. And Nancy in chat asks about the recent FDA changes and what would be the impact in upcoming pilots. Have you considered that?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's distressing, to say the least. I mean, I'm not too privy of what's happening at the FDA, but it's definitely caused some strain on our FDA colleagues who work with us. They don't share very much, but it's I think anyone I think who works with government agencies probably are feeling it's just I don't know, it's distressing. I don't really have not much more to add than that, for me.
Yeah, practically speaking, yeah, we've heard bits and pieces of this in some of the working group meetings with the more general things that our reviewers have shared with us. it is probably going to impact timelines a little bit in terms of their capacity for reviewing at the moment. So we are trying to be cognizant and certainly considerate of what they're going through at the moment. Again, I'm not putting words in their mouth here. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that we're trying to balance those situations while keeping the momentum going with, say, the finalization of Pilot 4, and then Pilot 5 is making tons of progress. Where we go in the future, we certainly hope we have future pilots. It just, we don't know the timing on how some of these things will launch in respect to their capacity at the moment.
Okay. Shifting back to R, Anne asks about a common theme in when talking in R and in pharma is about the risk of using open source licenses of R packages when shipping to FDA. Do you want to clear the line here?
I don't believe we've had any comments from our reviewers on, for all the pilots have obviously multiple R packages, whether they're doing the TLFs or the Shiny interactions or even the more recent WebAssembly, now dataset JSON. It hasn't come up yet. The one thing I can say is that as of, today, when we're talking here, there is definitely, you might say, a positive reputation that regulators give to packages hosted on CRAN. And so if a package can get on CRAN, as of now, we haven't had any issues with the packages that we've used in the pilots, in terms of our regulatory colleagues being able to install those and use those. So maybe it's a problem that will happen in the future, but at least with the packages that we've been using from CRAN, it has not come up yet.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, the FDA was very rigorous in wanting to, for the packages delivered with the submissions or package inside of the submissions, they would all be on CRAN. We had a problem with TIL, with having to create shims around
Right.
TIL because it was not on CRAN yet, but which that framework is now. So FDA seems very open for all of those packages in CRAN and don't create any hurdles from.
Yeah, I feel like because the risk of using R for your submission is like, with SAS, it's very easy to move the code over and they kind of just run it. Whereas R, everything you do slightly different, like you have a custom package that you submit rather than having on CRAN, just opens up another risk to the submission being slowed down. And that's, these are $billion drug submissions, and you don't want your programming language to be the bottleneck. So I think that's always a risk you should be considering is like how are they installing the package? I think there's a comment later on about like what happens if someone abandons the package that your whole submission depends on. So that's something I think internally you have to assess. Like if one guy from a obscure university is maintaining this package that is critical to your submission, that's a huge risk. I would really evaluate that package before you start using it in your environment. And I think packages like that are on the Pharmaverse or by companies like Absalon or Taurus, those are the packages you should be looking at to use.
Yeah, and I will say, just to add to that, we've been fortunate to have some representation from package developers who are also part of our working groups. So, for example, with dataset JSON, which we're using for Pilot 5, Nicholas Massel, he's one of the developers of dataset JSON. So it's great, since we needed a version update for some of the work we're doing there, he was able to make sure that gets pushed on over to CRAN, and now we're leveraging that newest version of dataset JSON for Pilot 5.
Yeah, and there's a question from Chelsea, very interesting about what do the FDA reviewers, if there are any features of or details that have been learned from you guys when submitting to a Shiny application to FDA, and what do the reviewers say in return? given what, because it's not a static content anymore. Instead of submitting a static document with figure TLGs, we are now submitting a dynamic application. And do they like that dynamism and that dynamic style?
Oh, I can share one of the biggest learnings we got from this. So in the Pilot 2 app, as Ben alluded to, it's really an HTML web-based representation of the TOFs that were in Pilot 1. But one thing we added in addition to just those representations is the ability to filter the input data, especially if you want to look at, say, patients of age less than 40 or something like that. What was interesting is in our first I would say, the feedback that we got from the FDA after we did an initial version of Pilot 2, as we alluded to earlier, Andre, it does use TO modules to help with that filtering, which was really helpful for me as an app developer. And I had to build all that myself. I just run the TO module inside, and it was, doing the input filtering of the data, I should say, and then all the tables were refreshed. Many of those tables had p-value inferences. So that was one thing that our reviewers said to us is, well, if this, even though it's a pilot submission, it's not a real study, it's based on open data from CDIS. If that analysis plan didn't specify that you're going to run that same model for, say, this cut of patients, with this age cutoff or a lab measure cutoff, that could give the wrong impression of what we often call p-hacking or inflating type 1 error for your p-value assessments. So the compromise was we will take out the p-values for any of the, or I should say we will take out the ability to filter patients for those static tables that did the p-value inferences. However, for the graph visualization we did, which is a time to event curve of a clinical outcome, since that wasn't doing inference, it was doing survival curves, they were fine with keeping the TO module for filtering patients on that visualization, which then struck that nice balance of the interactivity that Shiny brings, but not causing any analysis misinterpretation potentially, even though statisticians know that any filtering done for those other established tables was not pre-specified. They wouldn't put any real stock into it. It's in a real submission. You're obviously going to have medical colleagues and others reviewing these submissions on their side. And you don't want anything misleading those reviewers with these inferences that could be generated based on the dynamic way of filtering data. So I think that was the biggest consideration we learned. Again, midway through Pilot 2's development, is that we do have to be careful of that interactivity in any analysis models that are resulting in some kind of inference being displayed, to make sure that that's not giving a misconception on those results. So that would be the easy one for me to summarize.
But Jared suggests that if we could put a disclaimer on the applications for this very issue.
We did add a disclaimer even in the interactive graphics section of the app that the filters being applied were not impacting the established clinical analysis. So maybe that changes over time, but I dare say our reviewers were pretty firm about you got to take that out in this initial submission. So it's certainly not going to be the last time Shiny's involved in a submission. Maybe things change, but that was the guidance we got in Pilot 2.
Thanks, Eric. And what are your thoughts on cross-platform compatibility? Does the FDA expect the files and programs to run independent of the environment, or are you targeting the Windows system, Linux, Mac OS? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, the reviewers have Windows operating systems. You better work. Or
yeah,
that's
it's without putting my biases into this forum, those that know me know my bias for operating systems. It's a practical reality. Will that change? Maybe, but first, on the sponsor side, it is obviously their responsibility to, for their internal procedures and infrastructure that the code runs effectively, and to the to their validation requirements internally. Externally, when you submit this to a regulator, you just got to be cognizant that as of now, they are running in that Windows environment. So, do I wish? No, another potential of this container environment is that in theory, then the actual operating system that's running that code is not Windows anymore. Windows is just that layer to get to the container. And then in a future state, if a sponsor is developing their submission in a container and they give the exact same instructions for installing that container to the regulators as they had on their infrastructure, you do hopefully eliminate some of that potential variability. Again, I don't think we're there yet. Hopefully, we get there someday. But I think we just have to be cognizant of the practical realities on how these submissions are being evaluated at the moment.
Yeah, and I will say that Eric, you did a great job, testing our submissions on a Windows machine through a virtual environment, and just making sure that it works. And I think that's been a nice sort of sanity check for us, just to make sure that hopefully after we submit it, it'll run on the FDA reviewers' machines. But just as well, I think Pilot 4 is looking at really alternative mechanisms or means to submitting the solutions.
Yeah, Pilot 3, we included like screenshots of the Windows operating system and like installing the RENV package and then using the lock file to install all the packages from CRAN. Like we kind of just did a play-by-play, which the reviewers had no problems with. I mean, they were able to install everything and run all of our code, which just from the ADRG instructions.
Yeah, I can say that they have never, they have always appreciated extensive documentation on these fronts. It's never, at least in my experience of Pilot 2 and Pilot 4, you can never have too much documentation on these details. Well, maybe you can, but I do take pride in the fact that we really step by step made sure that the packages they were installing via RM or others were matching what we were developing, so to speak. So other than being executed on Windows, but again, R being cross-platform already under the hood, should not impact anything at that point, as long as you got those package versions consistent with what you developed with.
Someone actually made a comment about, with the ADRG, you can you just say SAS 9.4, like done. Like with R, you can really open a can of worms with how much information you put in there, and then how, really like when you're validating your environment, that's another step. And I think sometimes people want to put all that information in the ADRG. So I think the Fuse working group that's looking at this will hopefully produce some really good guidance on what we should be including, but maybe not overburdening the reviewers with a lot of extra information that is, like, do you really need like the third layer of dependencies for your package, like listed in the ADRG? This seems a little overkill to me. So where that stuff is actually listed, like in the lock file for REMV.
We have a question from Jared about creating a template way of level containers, so that they can just download it and use it. I guess that's part of what we want to do, what we want to have with Pilot 4, but maybe not a template. We haven't generated a template. We just generated a proof of concept about submission using containers.
It's a great idea in spirit because it would simplify things a bit. We actually had a side conversation about this in the ecosystem of our package to generate clinical tables. There's a lot out there. One sponsor might think one table is great for this, like GT, and everyone might like our tables. Everyone's wrong. And I'm a little hesitant about the container template because I think sponsors might have their own individual ideas how they bootstrap those, and not just on the R side of things, but on the other side of things too. What we hope Pilot 4 shows is that, with some frameworks that you build upon, like I'm a fan of the Rocker project that Dirk Edebutel and others, where they have Docker images tailored to R installation on multiple levels, whether you want all the tidyverse in it, or you want a shiny version of that, or just a very basic version, and then you build on top of that, which is what we do for Pilot 4. I think that may be the closest you get as of now, but maybe in the future, as container technology starts to become more mainstream in clinical submission work, maybe there could be a agreed upon kind of standard set, but there's a lot of variation involved, unfortunately.
I I thought I heard someone talking about like a golden image, like trying to. Oh, Andre, you know what I'm talking about? There was some. I remember there was some talk. I don't know if that was being driven by our consortium or um, there were some working groups looking at like building an image that everyone could pull from that has a certain set of packages. But again, I think every sponsor is going to have a different opinion. So it's the standardization that's hard.
Yeah, I think the R validation hub is working on that golden image, but mostly to create the process, not an image shined by the R consortium, but creating a process that can be common by used by the sponsors as a baseline to do their submissions in the work, kind of like the rocker images, but guided towards pharma.
Mhm.
We are almost running out of time. Maybe we have time for one more question. Uh, if well, I don't. I think we've gone through most of the questions on chat, if not all. A lot of good comments around. Yours.
I see there is one that Fonny's mentioned that I'm surprised didn't come up yet.
Which one? Sorry.
Validation in R. Yeah, that could be a whole nother webinar in and of itself.
Yeah.
But that's like not our, you know, that's like another working group within
Exactly.
the R consortium, which is very active. And if that's something that interests you, the validation part, I mean, that goes back to I think there was a question about like, the package maintainer abandoning their package and that impacting your submission. I mean, that goes into that kind of risk assessment framework of the package, which I think is crucial. You don't, like a lot of people do these packages out of love for the community and open source, but they might get burnt out and abandon something. So it's good to be kind of cognizant of like who is maintaining this package, and you know, is there a sponsor behind the package? But yeah, the validation group is very active, and I encourage people to check it out on their the Slack channel. It's actually the same Slack group as the submissions working group.
Yeah, definitely encourage people to check out the R validation hub, and then you can also look at risk metric, risk assessment, some of the work from Jumping Rivers. I think that are some good resources to check out.
Yeah, it's one thing maybe, yeah, as we're wrapping up here, we are pretty, I would say, careful about the scope of these pilots because when you think about R and submission, there are so many different directions you can take with this. I really like the fact that, as Ben alluded to at the outset, it's been very much a climbing a gradual step or a set of steps. The TLGs first, the TOFs first, just showing that, with the ecosystem, we can prove that. Then, oh, shiny, really? Yeah, we can do that. And then now with the Atom generation, now and we really upped the game with the container and WebAssembly technology because we thought, well, we got some momentum here, but none of this is possible without like really being hyper focused on the goal at hand because there is no way one pilot can accomplish to answer all these questions. But we hope that the evolution of these, when you take them as a whole, can be inspiring to obviously sponsors that are getting involved with R and open source, but also to anybody interested in joining these efforts.
Yeah, and thanks again to Absalon for hosting, Andre. We really appreciate you guys. You guys are great in the community. We definitely appreciate y'all
Oh,
driving this forward.
thanks. We love to drive this kind of discussion in the community and just push the industry forward and help pushing the industry forward together, all together. So that wraps up today's deep dive into the FDA pilots and the evolving role of R in regulatory submissions. So a big thank you for Ben, Eric, and Sam for sharing their expertise and giving us a behind the look behind the scenes look at these groundbreaking initiatives. Before you go, please be sure to check out our upcoming Shiny Gathering, where we bring community together exploring the latest in our Shiny development, use cases, and innovations across pharma and beyond. Don't miss out on the free ebook, Ultimate Guide on Open Source for Clinical Trial Leaders, a must-read resource for anyone looking to stay ahead in clinical data science and regulatory transformation. Mark your calendars for May 27, which with our next Shiny Gathering on ANCA, where the creators of this powerful tool will all walk you through its development, features, and real-world applications in non-compartmental analysis. It's a fantastic opportunity to see open source innovation in action and learn how to apply ANCA in your own workflows. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, stay curious, stay open, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in R. Bye, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you
Bye.
guys again.